Hello, my name is Michael Hammer, and I'd like to share with you some of what I've learned about what it takes to successfully implement SAP. As I'm sure you're aware, SAP is a very well-known software company which sells a software system of more or less the same name. SAP has received a great deal of attention in the last couple of years. It dominates the category of software programs called ERP, which is a rather obscure acronym for Enterprise Resource Planning. It's sold around the world, has been implemented by thousands of companies. There have been reports in the press about how SAP is transforming corporate computing and the lives of the corporations that implement it. But at the same time, there have been some press reports that indicate that not all is well in paradise. That despite all the sales and implementations of SAP, some companies are having difficulties. We hear stories about companies that have gone way over budget, whose schedules have been blown out of the water, and who've experienced all kinds of difficulty in implementing SAP. Now, I've talked to a lot of these companies, and I've asked them what lay behind their difficulty in implementation. And the problem is, I don't get consistent answers. Some tell me that the software wasn't flexible enough. On the other hand, some tell me the software was too flexible. Other people blame the consultants. Of course, when in doubt, blame the consultants. Others feel that the real problem is that their CIO was an incarnation of Satan. All kinds of problems, but they don't add up. And so I became interested in trying to identify the source of these problems and how bad it was. And some time ago, I gathered together a group of companies, 50 to 60 major corporations with whom we work on a recurring basis. And we had a discussion about SAP. And I asked these companies to self-evaluate themselves on how effective their implementation had been on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 would have been an unmitigated disaster and 10 was supreme success. And I was very interested by the shape of the curve that resulted. What we had is a cluster of 3s and another cluster of 8s. In other words, a lot of companies felt that implementing SAP had been enormously successful and productive for them, and another cluster of companies had nothing but complaints. Now, this kind of distribution with 2 peaks is technically known as a bimodal curve. And I'm very interested in bimodal curves. In fact, I make my living off them. Because if the issue that was driving these companies was simply how well they implemented SAP, I don't think we would have had a bimodal curve. We would have had a more traditional bell curve. In other words, most companies in the middle and a few outliers at either end. But that's not the way it shaped up. We had winners and we had losers. What separates and what distinguishes the winners from the losers? In my experience, there's almost always a common explanation for that kind of bimodal distribution. It's not that the 8s work harder than the 3s. The 8s have more technique than the 3s. Because if that was the issue, it would be a bell curve. The issue is that the 8s get it and the 3s don't. Or to put it bluntly, the 8s are smart and the 3s are dumb. The 8s understand what they're doing. They have the right conceptualization of what SAP implementation really is. The 3s, on the other hand, don't have a clue. What do the 3s think is going on? It's very simple. The 3s think that SAP implementation is nothing more than software installation. And they manage it as a technical software installation effort. And they crash and burn. And they end flat on their faces. Why? Because that's the smallest part of SAP. SAP is indeed a software package, but implementing it is not a technical exercise. Implementing SAP is a fundamental business initiative that transforms your organization. And the 8s understand that. In order to appreciate this, we have to rethink the nature of the problem we're trying to solve. Too many people feel that when they're implementing SAP, they're installing some new software systems that will be easier to maintain, easier to interface, easier to extend than the old legacy systems that they've had in the past. That may or may not be true, but that's almost irrelevant. What we're doing is solving an entirely different problem. And that problem is not technical, but organizational in nature. And to understand that, we have to step back for a minute and understand some fundamental shortcomings with virtually every organization we have today. Today's organization is a functional organization. Its building blocks are functional departments: sales and marketing, engineering and production, distribution and billing. We often refer to these as functional silos or functional stovepipes or functional smokestacks. To be perfectly frank, those are all a little too Freudian for me. So I have an alternative model. I think of them as functional castles, little fiefdoms with high walls and moats around them. And if you look very carefully at them, you'll see that at the top of each of these castles, there's a catapult. What's up with that? Well, if we're in one of these castles, whether it's sales or marketing or engineering or production or logistics, and we finish our work, what do? We wind that catapult up and throw our work over the walls to the clowns in the next castle. And from our point of view, we're finished, because we've done our job. In fact, I'm going to give you a little test that you can use to determine if you are in a functional castle organization. Can you identify the most commonly heard phrase in a functional organization just from its initials? The initials are INMJ. Yes, that's what I was afraid of. You got it right away. It's not my job. We hear it all the time. Hey, what do you want from me? I handled the order. It's not my job if it came in late. Hey, I figured out the best delivery method. It's not my job if we didn't have it in stock. Everyone is concerned with his or her own piece, his or her own castle. Now you might say to me, so what? What's the matter with a functional castle-like organization? Well, just think how things work for a customer in this kind of organization. For example, think how we fill an order. The customer calls in, talks to customer service, and provides the order. Customer service does their work, they write it up, and then they put it in their catapult and hurl it over the wall to the folks in credit. They do their work, and they hurl it over the wall to production control for inventory allocation. And then it goes to the warehouse, and then it goes to logistics, and then it goes to billing, and so on. The life of an order is a series of catapult hurls. And the trouble is, when the work gets done that way, it doesn't get done well. Every time we have one of these hurls from organization to organization, what we really have is a handoff. And whenever there's a handoff, there's delay. It sits at my desk, it eventually gets to you, and it sits when it gets to you. We have errors, misunderstanding and miscommunication, because I can't put everything I know into the catapult. And therefore what reaches you is less than a complete version of what I know. We have excess costs. We have to pay people to staff the catapults, to receive the incoming, to interpret, and then to send back additional catapult hurls to request clarification on what the first one meant. What we have is the proliferation of non-value adding work. Work that doesn't do anything for the customer, but is merely an artifact of our arbitrary, unnatural castle organization. And non-value adding work generates cost, it generates delay, it generates errors, it generates inflexibility. We can't work the way the customer wants us to. Now you might say, well, why do we continue with this castle-like organization? Why don't we just throw it away? Well, there's a lot of things that contribute to its perpetuation. First of all, people don't know anything outside of their own castle. They're really pretty unfamiliar with the larger operation of the organization. There's the matter of what I call organizational affiliation. They see themselves as part of their castle, not part of the larger enterprise. Well, I work for General Mills or General Motors. It's General something. I'm a finance person. Thirdly, there's rewards and incentives and measures. Everyone is rewarded and incented on the performance of their castle, and they have no concern or interest in how the whole system operates together. They're not measured on it. They're not responsible for it. It's not their job. For example, in a manufacturing company I know, a sales rep brought in an order from a new customer. The customer said, it's a small order, but if you fill it well, there'll be a lot of business to follow. So the sales rep wrote it up, fast, now, do it, now. And he started to put it into the catapults. Eventually, it comes down to traffic planning, the shipping department, who looks at it and said, uh-oh, this is a dreaded LTL, less than truckload order. If we send it fast, what will happen to our shipping costs? They'll go up. Let's see here. How are we measured? On shipping costs. Will the sales rep be by to share some of his juicy commission with us? We think not. It'll go by boat. Now, were these guys being bad guys? Certainly not. They were being smart. They were doing what they were told. And in fact, if they dared to do anything else, if they dared to peek their heads over the edge of the castle, bonk, that's what would happen to them. Their responsibility is narrow. And I'll tell you one other invidious phenomenon that reinforces and strengthens those castle walls, and that, of course, is our legacy information systems. Because the computer systems with which we operate today are all castle-focused. We have a marketing system and a manufacturing system and an HR system, and they are all independent and isolated. You probably have heard the term islands of automation, each one unto itself. How so? Because the functional manager, the head of the castle, needed to improve the performance of his or her unit, went to the information systems folks and said, give me the best possible system you can to help me improve the performance and productivity of my part of the enterprise. And the information systems organization did so. And what we have is an amazing case of Pareto suboptimization, where every castle is performing really well and the company as a whole is going to hell. Why? Let's suppose you're a customer. You've called up customer service and you've given them the order. And you say, oh, by the way, do you have this in stock? What does customer service say? Don't know. Why not? It's not in our system. That's in production control system. Better call them. So the customer calls production control to find out if they have it in stock. He learns they do. He says, okay, by the way, when will it arrive? What does production control say? Beats us. We don't know. We don't have that data. It's not in our system. You better call logistics. The poor customer calls logistics. Says, when will it arrive? They tell him. He says, by the way, have you processed my return that I sent back? Have you given me credit for that? They say, beats us. We don't know. We don't have that information. Not in our system. You better call billing. He calls billing, gets that resolved. Says, by the way, I need to change the ship to address on my order. Can you do it? They say, not a chance. We don't have that data. Better call customer service. What we have are functional systems that punish the customer for our organizational structure, that reinforce those castle walls, that focus on narrow optimization of bits of the business rather than the whole thing. Now, we have a technical term for describing what's going on here. The term is process fragmentation. Now, process is not a very dramatic word, but in fact, in my view, it's the most important word in business operations today. It's a very simple idea. A process is an organized group of activities that together create customer value. Once again, an organized group of activities that together create customer value. No single activity. It's all of them working together in concert. For example, filling an order has a lot of activities, no one of which counts on its own. You got to process the order, you got to check the credit, set aside the inventory, you have to do the picking and the packing and the traffic planning and the shipping. Any one of them isn't enough. All of them, missing any one of them isn't enough. You have to bring them all together. The trouble is, in our organization, the processes are fragmented. They're broken into pieces, and each one is buried in the basement dungeon of each castle. The processes are invisible. Nobody can see the whole process because everyone is stuck behind the walls of his or her castle. That's the backdrop against which we're trying to implement SAP. Now, what is SAP? It turns out many people don't understand it. I ask a lot of people, what do you think is the most interesting and important feature of SAP? And I get a lot of very narrow details. People tell me things like multi-currency. Well, I guess that's okay. I wouldn't call it the most important thing. Let me tell you the most important feature and aspect of SAP. In fact, the defining characteristic of SAP. It is integration. SAP is not a functional system. It's not an inventory management system or a production control system or a distribution system. It is all of them. It is an omnifunctional system which addresses all the castles of the enterprise and brings them together with seamless interfaces and share data so they work together, cooperate, and communicate. What SAP does is knock down the castle walls and build bridges between those individual entities. Now, this may not sound like a big idea. Let me tell you, it is a revolution, because it is something we've never had before in the history of computing. I go back 30 years in information technology. I used to work on systems like this in the early 70s. We couldn't get them to work. It has taken 20-some years of evolution and advancement in hardware technology and software technology to get to the point where we could have a robust, operational, high-performance, integrated application system. This is a revolution. I don't even like the rather archaic acronym ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. I think there are better ways to describe what SAP is. One is to call it an integrated enterprise software system, one that supports the whole enterprise in an integrated, unified way. Another way is to recognize that SAP is really a process-oriented software system rather than a functionally oriented software system. SAP supports not one castle, but the entire end-to-end process of filling an order, producing goods, or whatever it is you're trying to do in your company. Because all the parts fit together, the process is no longer fragmented, it's no longer invisible. For example, consider the scenario we had before, but now in an SAP environment. You talk to a customer service rep, you give them the order, and you say, by the way, do you have it in stock? The rep says, hold on a second, I'll tell you. Because from his or her terminal, the rep has access to full data about everything that's going on in the enterprise. If you happen later to be talking to logistics and ask them, by the way, have you processed my return? They say, no problem. We can tell you. We can get access to the shared data. We don't have to hand you off to the finance organization so they can access the finance data. SAP brings the whole enterprise together. That's where its power comes from, and that's where the issues lie in its implementation. Because what happens when you implement SAP? First thing that happens is that processes suddenly become visible. In the old days, nobody could see over the castle wall. Nobody had any sense of the larger context of his or her work. All you saw was your task and your narrow system that supported it. All of a sudden now, I understand the whole flow The SAP terminology is transaction flow, of how my work fits into the larger context, of how I, as a customer service rep, am really connected to someone in logistics, or someone in manufacturing, or someone in finance. I see how my work wends its way through the whole organization. Processes which had formerly been hidden, invisible, buried, and fragmented now come center stage. Secondly, jobs broaden. No longer am I limited to being able to do only those things enabled by a narrow functional system. Now, as a user of an integrated system, I have access to a much broader range of information. My job is no longer limited to a single task. It's doing whatever is required to focus on the customer and solve that customer's problem. Next, organizational boundaries begin to dissolve and fade away. The old functional systems reinforce the castle walls. SAP knocks them down. In the old days, it would be almost precise to say that the customer service department was those people who use the customer service system. That was how our organization was structured. Now, with an SAP integrated process system, it's very hard to draw boundaries. Since I can get involved in your work and you in mine, and since we relate to and understand one another, where is the boundary between my department and yours? Is it in fact a meaningful idea anymore? Moreover, authority moves to the front lines. Information is power. In the old days, only managers had information. If I was working, I only had a narrow slice of information with a very narrow perspective. And in order to make decisions, in order to do anything of any consequence or import, I had to go to my boss. Now, sitting in front of an SAP terminal, I have access to a whole universe of data. I know the information, I have the big picture, I understand the customer, I know our production schedule, I appreciate the financial consequences. It is true empowerment for me, the frontline person, which means it's disempowerment for you as my manager. What do I need you for? What can you do that I can't do on my own now? Finally, processes not only become visible, they become standardized. In the old castle organization, process performance was not only slow and unreliable, it was somewhat ad hoc and haphazard. If the catapult happened to be pointing in the right direction, the information would get to the next department. But if the wind was blowing, we might shoot it off in some other direction in a different way, and who knows who would get it and who would run with it. Getting work done on an end-to-end basis was often an adventure in improvisation. With SAP, everything's brought together, everything's defined, the whole flow is in there. It becomes regularized and standardized. So let's review. You implement SAP, whether or not you want it, whether or not you intend it, whether or not you have any clue as to what's going on, this is what happens. Your processes take center stage, they become regularized and standardized. Jobs broaden, organizational boundaries fall, authority moves to the front lines. Do you know what we call that? I'll tell you what I call it: re-engineering. Now, re-engineering is a term that many people misuse and abuse, but I made up the term, so I get to make up what it means. It means radical change in processes. And that's what we have here. Instead of processes being fragmented, they're integrated. Instead of processes being ad hoc, they're regularized. Instead of jobs being narrow, they're broadened. That's radical fundamental change, that's re-engineering, and that's what you get when you implement SAP. And I'll repeat what I said earlier. It doesn't matter if that's what you thought you were doing, that's what happens. When you give people data, they'll use it. When you provide communication, it knocks down walls. It doesn't matter if that was your goal, that will be the consequence. This explains the 3s and the 8s. The 3s, the losers, thought they were merely implementing a software system more or less like any other software system. The eights realized that they were re-engineering. They were re-engineering with SAP. And having realized it, they decided to do it consciously. They integrated their SAP program with a re-engineering program. They didn't have just one, nor did they have them independent and isolated. Successful companies at SAP implementation, and we could be talking about IBM or Hewlett-Packard or Owens Corning or Elf Atacam, integrate their SAP implementation with a deliberate re-engineering of their business processes, because they realize they're going to have it whether or not they want it, so they might as well make it happen deliberately. It also helps us understand what it takes to have it succeed. Because if you're going to do re-engineering with SAP, you might as well know the hard parts so you can plan for them and get them done right. Now, to illustrate these hard parts, I want to tell you a true story. I call it the tale of a three. In fact, I ran across this at one company, and since then, a great many other companies have told me it's their biography as well. So if you wish to self-identify as the subject of this tale, feel free to do so. Send us a postcard. This story begins about 5 years ago. A large corporation, where the information systems leadership decided that their legacy systems were in deep trouble. They were hard to maintain, they were hard to keep going, they were falling apart, too costly, running 17 levels of emulation. They decided we're going to replace these and bring in integrated system, a new application suite, SAP. And they thought they would just do this within their purview since they were the technical guys. What they didn't count on was the revolt of the functional managers. Because the functional managers recognized pretty quickly that this was going to intrude on them. That this wasn't a system to serve them, it was a system to serve the process and the enterprise, and would require that they cooperate and compromise, two words with which they were unfamiliar. And they raised a red flag, and they said, no, this intrudes on our autonomy. Autonomy was a big theme at this company. Autonomy was defined as every manager being able to do what he or she thought was right in the context of what was best for the company. The trouble is, all the managers in this company had very short attention spans and could never remember the second half of the definition. What they wanted to do was what they wanted to do. So they raised all kinds of red flags. No, we can't do this. Now, the systems people were shocked at all this overt hostility, and they beat a hasty retreat, and they said, sorry, we didn't mean to upset you, our users. We're here to please you. We're not going to implement this broad suite of applications that seem to upset you. What we will do is just implement one module. And you know which module they wanted to implement. That, of course, was financials. They said our financial systems are falling apart. Let's at least introduce standardized financials. Now, there were a couple of interesting things about this. First of all, they realized pretty soon that the financial system was going to have to get its data from all the existing legacy operating systems. And they drew a new system architecture, which became officially known as the roadmap to hell. They realized it was going to take a lot of effort and a lot of money to interconnect, kludge up this new financial package with all the existing operating legacy systems. Moreover, they went to do the cost-benefit analysis of what the payback was going to be merely of replacing the financial system. And the payback was going to be nothing. Break even. If the wind was in the right direction and the weather held, we would end up just where we were. That is, the payoffs would just account for the costs. Rather peculiar notion of success, but nonetheless, they were going to proceed. And then it hit the fan again. This time, it was one of the divisional managers. who looked at this financial package and he realized that he was going to have to conform to the new financial system that they were putting in. And he said, sorry, my division can't possibly do that because we are different. And a big hullabaloo arose about this division not being able to conform to the strictures and limitations of the SAP financial module. So what did they do? They came to an agreement. This divisional general manager commissioned the systems organization to go out and find a financial package that met his unit's needs exactly. I refer to this as the search for the Holy Grail, because from the outset it was completely obvious, both to IS and to the divisional general manager, that there was no such system. Of course, this didn't interfere with their commissioning such a search. From IS's point of view, it was terrific. It gave them something to do. And from the divisional general manager's point of view, it kept IS out of his hair. I call this a codependency relationship. And they were happily going along, spinning their wheels, and then a terrible event occurred. What happened was the corporate aircraft was malfunctioning, and the CEO had to fly commercial. Oh, no. Let me tell you my advice, never let the CEO fly commercial. You'll never know what information he or she might run into. And in this case, the CEO encountered a very important new source of information, namely an airline magazine. And sitting there, opened the airline magazine and read an article about the year 2000 problem. The CEO discovers that all his systems are about to crash and burn on January 1st, 2000, and he comes back to headquarters and sounds an alarm. The sky is falling. And they say, okay, we'll get rid of our applications and we'll bring in the whole SAP suite, and that's going to eliminate our need for fixing the Y2K problem. Well, the functional managers and the divisional general managers couldn't hardly object to this, so they changed their tune. And they said, yes, yes, of course. Oh, what a good idea. But no, we have to do this very carefully. Since we will all be sharing common database, the first thing we have to do is establish a data standards committee to determine the common data structures and semantics that we all will utilize. And they've put together a cross-divisional, all-singing, all-dancing, universal intergalactic data standards committee whose report is expected in the year 3000. And the saddest part of this story is that when I talk to the systems executives of this company, half of them think that everything's going just fine. The other half realize there are problems, and I ask them, who's to blame for the problems? What's the nature of the problem? And they blame SAP, or the software, or the consultant. In fact, obviously, that's not the issue at all, and things are not going well. What is going on? It's very, very clear. When you implement SAP, you are focusing on processes. Processes cross organizational boundaries. They have no existing natural defenders. Moreover, you're changing power structures, jobs, relationships, everything in the organization. You're intruding standards on people who used to be cowboys. You are sharing information among people who didn't know each other existed. You are taking responsibility and authority away from executives and putting it into the front line. This is big deal change. And big deal change inevitably provokes huge resistance. It's unavoidable. And that's why SAP runs into trouble. We did a conference not too long ago on SAP and re-engineering. We had 700 people from several hundred companies. We did a poll, a survey. We asked them a number of questions. We asked them, for example, first, what were the major consequences of SAP implementation in their company? They told us changes to existing jobs, increased corporate control, dissolving organizational boundaries. We asked them to identify the key factors preventing greater SAP implementation success. The top 3 answers we got were insufficient executive leadership, lack of organizational readiness, and organizational resistance to change. We asked them about their top SAP implementation error. They told us failing to invest adequately in communications and change management. We asked them for the 3 most critical success factors for SAP implementation. What they told us was strong project management, intense executive commitment, and a revised compensation system to keep people focused on common goals. You know what's interesting about that entire list? Whether it's the consequences, the errors, the critical success factors, or the mistakes, none of it has a darn thing to do with software, technology, or SAP. What is it all about? It's about organizations, people, and change. Now, this may be something that's hard for some of you to accept. I know it was hard for me to accept because I was born and bred and raised as an engineer. Let me share with you something that I learned 20 years ago when I was a professor of computer science at MIT, and I thought that the sun rose and set on computer software. This is something I learned from one of my colleagues in the business school. I resented it at first, and it's one of the best bits of advice that I've ever had. And I want you to repeat after me. The technical problems are the easy problems. Go on, it'll make you feel better. The technical problems are the easy problems. If a problem can be defined and shaped in technical terms, then all it requires is intelligence and hard work to solve it. The really hard problems are the human and the organizational and the change problems. Or to put it another way, the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And the soft stuff is messy. And the folks who manage SAP implementation as a technical exercise in software installation are going to be completely oblivious to the real problems that are going to impede implementation and destroy their chances for success. And these problems have nothing to do with the software or the tables or the 4th generation language or the consultants or any of that. These problems have to do with the organization's resistance to fundamental change, the change which knocks down castle walls, which turns you from a vertical to a horizontal organization, which focuses everybody around end-to-end processes, which disempowers the hierarchy and puts control in the hands of people on the front line. That's what SAP does, and that's what gets in the way of successful implementation. So if you want to succeed, the first thing you have to do is understand and be aware of the nature of the real problems, and then be prepared to address them. Let me summarize for you what I have seen as the key tactical responses that organizations have made in order to overcome these barriers to successful implementation. Number 1, positioning it as a strategic business initiative. If the organization perceives this as a technical implementation project driven by the systems organization, they will conclude that it is of secondary importance, has no real power behind it, and will act out in all kinds of ways to prevent the changes that are the inevitable consequences of successful implementation. In other words, they'll shoot it dead in the water. You have to make everybody recognize that this is not a software project. It is a business change project which is fundamental and strategic to the success of the enterprise. Number 2, passionate, committed executive leadership. I do not say executive support. I hate the term executive support. Whenever I hear it, I hear someone saying, "I'm behind you." way behind you. You all going ahead, I'll stay here in the rear with the gear. That's not what you need. That's passive. You need active executive leadership. The senior management of the company has to recognize that this is not something they can delegate, not something they can push off to technical experts. It's their project. Their project that they have to take personal responsibility for. Number 3 requirement, that the leadership do whatever it takes to ensure successful implementation, to put in the resources, and in particular, to remove the roadblocks that will inevitably crop up. Let me give you an illustration. I visited a company recently that was beginning SAP implementation. I'd be willing to lay money that they're going to succeed. Because at the program kickoff, here's what they did. They brought together the top 400 people from around the world for a 2-day meeting. This was an unprecedented event. These people had never been in a room together. Secondly, it was a 2-day meeting in the 4th quarter of the fiscal year. Of course, that's what everybody wants to do in the 4th quarter, come home for a 2-day meeting. What they really want to do is make their numbers. The CEO said attendance is mandatory. And he opened the day of this meeting with an impassioned address as to why this program was an absolute requirement for the future success of the company. It wasn't a nice to have, it wasn't an efficiency improvement, it was going to be the difference between success and failure. Even though the company was apparently doing very well. He painted a picture of a different future, of an evolving company, and if they didn't make these fundamental transformations, if they didn't improve process performance and support it with SAP implementation, they'd be in trouble. And then he said, this is not a technology project. This is a business project with a technology component. Process performance is the payoff, SAP is the tool. And he introduced the project leader, not a technical person, a well-respected, well-known senior line manager. And he then said as follows, we've just moved his office, and his office is now 20 feet from mine, and I'm going to talk to him about this project every day. In other words, the coded message is, if any of you weasels try to do anything to get in the way, I'm going to hear about it and you'll be gone. This company is going to succeed. Number 4, rapid decision making and rapid implementation. There is no such thing as slow major change. If you drag major change out of an extended period, people get tired, they lose credibility, they don't believe it's happening, and the whole thing collapses on itself. You have to move fast. It has to have momentum and inertia moving forward, which means you've got to be prepared to make the tough decisions and make them quickly. Number 5, you need process owners to be the key decision makers. The functional managers will never agree. Each one has his or her own area. The geographical, the business unit leaders all want to protect their turf. You must have senior leaders in the organization who are charged with end-to-end responsibility, the key business processes that are going to be improved and that are going to be supported by SAP, and it's their responsibility to make the key decisions, to ensure that the information is there, and to shepherd and oversee the implementation. If you leave it to traditional dukes of the castles, nothing will happen. Number 6, make the necessary investments. The implementation of SAP and re-engineering is not something that can be done on the cheap. The payoffs are dramatic. The ROIs or IRRs are not going to marginally beat your hurdle rate. If you do it right, we're looking at 40, 50, 80, 100% IRRs. But the investment is there. And the big investment is not going to be in the software itself. The big investment is in training and implementation, getting the people ready for this new way of working. And finally, don't stint on change management. The hardest part of all of this is going to be helping people over this transition, dealing with the roadblocks, helping people accommodate to a new way of working and a new way of living. This will take serious investment of time and energy on the part of executive leadership and everybody throughout the management chain. This is not something we like to do. Too many people think this is kind of touchy-feely stuff. As I said, the soft stuff is the hard stuff, and it is the key stuff, and you ignore it at your peril. That's what we've learned about the keys to SAP implementation success based on our understanding of what it's really about. Let's summarize some of what we've learned. Our existing organizations are functional fiefdoms whose walls are reinforced by traditional systems. These have drastic performance consequences and create all kinds of problems. What we need to do is focus on processes that cross functional boundaries and work together to deliver value to customers. SAP is in fact a process-oriented software system. It's an integrated application system that supports end-to-end business processes and can deliver dramatic performance improvements thereby. However, in so doing, it yields enormous organizational change, and that's the source of the difficulties. As people reject the changes that are imposed on them and their organizations. And consequently, the essence and key to success is the correct positioning of SAP, integrating it with re-engineering and driving it with passionate executive leadership. If you take that approach, you can be an 8, not a 3. It's not a matter of luck. It's not a matter of circumstance. It's up to you. It's your choice to make. Thank you very much.